not exposed to natural ventilation. Contains or has the potential to contain hazardous atmosphere, such as gases or vapors. Contains a material that has the potential to engulf an entrant. Contains any other recognized safety or health hazards, such as unguarded machinery, exposed live electrical wires, or heat stress. Have walls that converge inward or floors that slope downward and taper into a smaller area, which could trap or asphyxiate an entrant. Has limited or restricted means of entry or exit, for example, tanks, vessels, silos, storage bins, trenches and sumps deeper than 2 meters, pipelines, dragline tubs, and revolving frame compartments. Hot work and confined space entry permits are 2 different written or printed permits issued by Anglo-American Thermal Coal. This authorizes safe entry into confined spaces and specified hot work at specific locations and time periods. Oxygen-deficient atmosphere is an atmosphere containing less than 19.5% oxygen by volume. Hazardous atmosphere is an atmosphere that may expose individuals to risk of death, incapacitation, impairment of ability to self-rescue, injury, or acute illness. Acceptable entry conditions are conditions that must exist in a permit space to allow entry and to ensure that individuals involved with a permit-required confined space entry can safely enter into and work within the space. The 5 steps to safe hot work execution and confined space entry are: mandatory procedural requirements, authorizing hot work execution and confined space entry, preparing for hot work execution and confined space entry, executing hot work and perform work in confined spaces, and post-hot work and confined space entry requirements. Mandatory procedural requirements. The engineering manager is responsible for the following mandatory procedural requirements: register of all identified confined spaces per plant or area, including category classification. Confined spaces will be clearly identified with appropriate signage. Confined space and hot work procedures and planned task observations. Formal risk assessments per individual confined screening presentation. Have passed the hot work assessment and planned task observation before being appointed and authorized by the responsible section engineer. A thorough formal risk assessment is required to identify all hazards, to assess potential loss events, and to identify required barriers. Risk assessments are to be reviewed whenever processes, people, or circumstances change. Identified energies include potential, kinetic, thermal, chemical, acoustic, vibrating energies. These energies could lead to the following significant risks: death by suffocation, fire or explosions, lack of oxygen, claustrophobia, burns, inundation of fluid, engulfment or drowning, toxic fumes or substances, insect and/or snake bites, buried under materials such as mud, coal or rock, electrocution. Permit systems are intended to ensure that individuals involved with hot work or who have to enter confined spaces are aware of the associated hazards and that control measures are implemented to mitigate the risks. The permit system provides a step-by-step checklist and reminds workers of the required legislation, safety precautions, and responsibilities before, during, and after task executions. It also enables Anglo-American Thermal Coal to keep track of hot work and confined space entry activities and ensures that these activities are being conducted safely. A permit to work and to enter confined spaces is issued with authorization by a responsible person in charge of the work to be carried out. It is important to note that permits expire after 24 hours. Hot work operations are strictly prohibited under the following conditions: in areas where a hot work permit is required but not obtained, in areas where a sprinkler or other fire suppression system is activated, in the presence of explosive atmospheres such as mixture of flammable gases, vapors, liquids or dust, in areas near to the storage of large quantities of flammable or combustible materials that can readily ignite, on any rim or components onto which a tire is fitted. Preparing for hot work execution and confined space entry. Preparation to execute hot work and to enter confined spaces includes isolation and lockout, emergency response plan, correct personal protective equipment, equipment inspections, confined space entry control, continuous risk assessment, SLAM, deactivate automatic fire suppression system, barricade areas, make safe of confined spaces. All sources of energy that might have a direct or indirect influence on the health and safety of persons in the confined space or working area must be isolated and locked out at the source by a responsible person, as per the Anglo-American Thermal Coal Isolation Fatal Risk Standard and procedures before commencement of any work. The keys are placed inside a lockable key cabinet. Every person locks the key cabinet with his own personal lock and fills in the lockout register with his personal details. The isolation procedure has further been established to prevent the introduction of contaminants or conditions through piping, ducts, vents, drains, conveyors, service pipes, etc. The activation or energizing of machinery inside and outside the confined space that could adversely affect the space. The release of any stored energy or potential energy in the plant, tools and equipment. An emergency response plan that was developed from a review of potential emergency scenarios must be in place and discussed before commencement of any work. When things go wrong in a confined space, people may be exposed to serious and immediate danger. Therefore, effective arrangements for raising the alarm and carrying out rescue operations in an emergency are essential. Ensure that there is additional fire suppression equipment available in the case of emergency, such as a fire tender on site during shutdowns. Another best practice is the commonly known dedicated position for fire extinguishers at a dragline shutdown. Additional fire extinguishers are positioned on the ground both sides of a dragline, next to the walking shoes and on deck, at both sides of the machinery house. The shutdown site layout plan also clearly identifies the position of all emergency response equipment. The correct personal protective equipment, also known as PPE, and respiratory protective equipment, RPE, as defined by the risk assessment and minimum site requirement, shall be used and maintained in a sanitary and reliable condition. PPE is issued against individuals' names. The scanning system provides accurate history and effectively controls cost. Minimum PPE site requirements for hot work execution include safety shoes, long leather spats over safety shoes with overall worn over the spats. Please take note that nylon-type overalls or jackets are not allowed. Long leather gloves, leather apron, dust mask, earplugs, fire-resistant skull cap with neck flap, face shield with goggles or welding helmet, lancing suit for lancing activities. The The supervisor issuing the permit to work is responsible for the inspection and signing of equipment logbooks, the check for gas equipment leakage, damage to electrical and welding gables, and special attention is given to welding tongue hand grips. The supervisor further checks that all welding, cutting, and ventilation equipment is safe to use and signs off equipment logbooks. Minimum required safety equipment includes